Hi, and welcome to our last video on semantics and pragmatics in this semester. In this video, I want to do a short wrap-up of everything that we've discussed so far. Okay, so in the second week, after having cleared all the administrative and organizational things, we've started talking about the text Cratylus by Plato. We've discussed how the different views on the origin of names, on the origin of words, have been discussed in the antiquity. And we've established the two basic positions in that tradition, the one being conventionalism, that words are basically the product of conventions, and on the other hand, naturalism, that words or names are naturally connected to their reference. In the next week, we discussed the so-called mentalese, also called language of thought, an idea that basically continues the naturalist group from the antiquity, and that was particularly important in the 60s and 70s. The main figure here would be Noam Chomsky, and in particular then Jerry Fodor. This idea basically says that meaning and concepts that we have, that we use when we talk, when we use language, does not emerge by language use, but is already pre-programmed in our minds. There is this famous quote by Jerry Fodor who says that one cannot learn a language unless one already has a language, right? So if you have, let's say, English as your native language and you want to learn German, you basically translate your English into German. And the same way, the same principle has to apply also if we have a look, if we want to understand how we acquire our L1, our native language. Right? But there were also some problems with this whole concept of mentalese. We've discussed the shortcomings, and in the week to come, in week 4, we discussed if mentalese, if language of thought is so problematic, what can we use instead to explain how we know things, how we know what words mean. And in that week, we talked about the intersubjective nature of languages, of language and of meaning. We discussed the 3 levels of knowledge that we necessarily need to know in order to communicate with other people. And we've discussed that knowledge 1 is basically the level of knowledge that we have about ourselves, about our own linguistic knowledge. So we know what words mean or what we mean by certain expressions. Then there is the second level of knowledge, when we know that what other people say when they want to express certain things. And this would not be enough. We need to also have access to a third level of knowledge when we know that other people know about us, that we what we want to say when we say certain things, right? And by this intersubjective knowing, meaning can function, and language can function as a network of conventions between individuals without the need to presuppose any innate categories in our brains or anything like that. The next week, there was no class, but in the week after that, week 6, we started discussing linguistic relativity, and we used the example of the basic color terms and basic color categories in English and in other languages. What we did in that session was that we discussed how we acquire words for different colors, and that there is probably a certain universal developmental pathway that leads from as the language community develops, as it comes in contact with certain cultural phenomena, more and more complicated colors get their basic color terms. And we discussed this with using the example of English and also the history of English. At the same time, we also discussed the shortcomings of this concept, because not all languages are like English, and it might be problematic to use English as the ultimate goal, so to speak, where every other language should ultimately arrive. Right. And in the week after that, we discussed the compositionality of meaning and how we can use semantic features to describe more complex meaning. Right? We discussed the basic idea that, for example, the meaning of the word boy, as opposed to the meaning man or girl, can be expressed by either the presence or absence of a certain semantic feature. We also said that underlying this compositionality idea is a very static view of meaning that is not changing, and it also assumes that certain expressions have inherent meanings, and this inherent meaning can be analyzed as a set of atoms. And the compositionality idea of semantics also does not include context and how it works with these semantic features. We also shortly talked about prototypes and prototype theory as a possible addition or a counter or alternative model to describe meaning without the need of postulating these atomic semantic features. In the next week, week 8, we discussed metaphors, and in particular conceptual metaphors based on the works by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, two famous books, Metaphors We Live By and Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. In that week, we had a guest lecture by Kirsten Middeker, who discussed conceptual metaphors of movement in Old English. In week 9, we discussed what propositional meaning is, and how does logic, meaning, and truth all relate to semantics. We discussed, for example, that sentences express propositions. We discussed the phenomena of entailment and presuppositions, and we also learned how to use truth tables and how to use logical operators such as negation, conjunction, disjunction, exclusive and inclusive, biconditional operator, and material implication. In the week to come, week 10, we started our block on pragmatics, and we discussed first speech acts as introduced by John Austin in the 50s in his, again, famous book, How to Do Things with Words. And we learned that sentences are not only based, or the meaning of sentences is not only based on truth values, but also on their pragmatic meaning, right? And in these terms, it has not really that much. It doesn't make that much sense to talk about false and true sentences, but rather about felicitous and infelicitous sentences. And we discussed the main idea, and we also discussed it using examples, that by speaking, we perform an act. We do something actually with our words. Right, in the following week, week 11, we discussed politeness or impoliteness and how this relates to the concept of faith, right? Again, based on two very well-known books. First one, Politeness, Some Universals in Language Use by Penelope Brown and Stephen Levinson, and Principles of Pragmatics by Jeffrey Leach. We discussed, using the example of American Idol, how different face-saving acts and face-threatening acts are used in conversations, how positive and negative politeness work, and what politeness maxims are, and how these politeness strategies are used in real situations. The next week, the 12th week, then was dedicated to discussing grammatical meaning, because so far we have been discussing lexical meaning and pragmatics. And another important aspect of meaning is grammatical meaning. And in this week, we discussed a special type of language change called grammaticalization, which leads from lexical meaning to grammatical meaning. And we analyzed a number of examples, and one of them was the development of the going to future, which in the course of time turned a lexical verb to go into a grammatical auxiliary to be going to or gonna, which has almost nothing to do with the original movement meaning of the verb to go. In the penultimate week of our course, we discussed the concept of linguistic landscapes and how not only individual expressions or sentences or propositions can have meaning, but also the use of languages itself can have meaning. We discussed language ideologies such as multilingualism, monolingualism, how these language ideologies get used in public signage in order to index and create certain social identities and categories, and to express social meaning. And we did all that using examples from Berlin, and how in Berlin multilingual signs, official and private, are used and what the message is behind them. Right, so by doing that, we went through 4 big thematic blocks. The first one in the first part of the course on the history of semantic thinking. We discussed Cratylus, mentalese, and the idea of intersubjectivity. Then we had 4 weeks when we discussed very basic concepts in semantics, right? So linguistic relativity, semantic features and the compositionality of meaning, then metaphors and conceptual metaphors, and propositional meaning and the relation between truth, logic, and meaning. Then another block began on pragmatics when we discussed speech acts, politeness, impoliteness, and the idea of faith. And in this last block, we talked about the different aspects of meaning that are sometimes that don't really belong to the core of semantics and pragmatics, but they nevertheless are important to talk about when we talk about meaning. That is grammatical meaning and how social meaning gets used in linguistic landscapes. Okay, that's it. Thank you for watching. If you have any open questions or any other topics that you would like to talk about, then contact me and we'll have plenty of time to talk about everything in the last live session of this semester. Thank you once again, and bye.